Jessica J. Henry had everything to live for. At just 28 years old, she was beloved in her community, deeply devoted to her faith, and had just married her high school sweetheart. But on a cold February night in 2019, everything would change. What happened in those dark hours would shake a small town to its core, and the truth that emerged would be more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of a crime that seemed impossible, committed by someone who seemed beyond suspicion. For Jessica, life in Greenville, South Carolina, seemed almost perfect. She had grown up in the area, surrounded by family, friends, and a church community that had known her since childhood. Everyone who knew Jessica described her the same way: kind, compassionate, always willing to help others. She volunteered at the local food bank every Saturday, taught Sunday school to elementary kids, and had a smile that could light up any room she entered. Her social media painted the picture of an idyllic life. Photos of her and her husband David at church events, vacation snapshots from their honeymoon in the mountains, candid moments of laughter with friends. From the outside looking in, Jessica and David Henry were the kind of couple everyone admired. Young, in love, building a future together. But we don't have a lot of backstory on what really went on behind closed doors. Much of what we know about Jessica and David's relationship comes from piecing together fragments, from interviews with friends and family conducted after the tragedy, from text messages that would later be recovered, from social media posts that took on a darker meaning in hindsight. Jessica and David had met in high school, started dating their senior year, and stayed together through college despite attending different schools. By all accounts, they were inseparable. David was studying to become a youth pastor, following in his father's footsteps. His family had deep roots in their church, the Greenville Community Fellowship, a large congregation with nearly 2,000 members. David's father, Pastor Robert Henry, had led the church for over 20 years and was a respected figure throughout the region. When David proposed to Jessica in the spring of 2018, it seemed like a fairy tale moment. He arranged for the proposal to happen after a Sunday service in front of the entire congregation. Jessica said yes through tears of joy, and the church community celebrated with them. They were married that November in a ceremony at the same church, with David's father officiating. But something shifted after the wedding. Friends would later recall that Jessica seemed different, more withdrawn. She stopped posting on social media as frequently. When she did show up to volunteer events or church gatherings, some noticed she seemed distracted, even sad. A few close friends asked if everything was okay. Jessica always said yes, always forced that same bright smile, but the light behind her eyes had dimmed. What Jessica's friends didn't know was that David was struggling, financially, emotionally, spiritually. Despite being groomed for ministry his entire life, David was having serious doubts about his faith. He confided in his journal, entries that would later be discovered, that he felt like a fraud, that he was only pursuing ministry because it was expected of him, not because he felt called to it. That he resented the pressure from his father, the weight of expectation from the entire church community. And there were other issues. David had accumulated significant credit card debt, nearly $30,000 from online gambling and impulsive purchases. He kept this hidden from Jessica, opening credit cards in his name only, having the statements sent to a P.O. box she didn't know about. When confronted by his father about some suspicious charges on a church account, David lied, claiming the charges were fraudulent, but Pastor Robert didn't fully believe him. Jessica discovered the debt by accident in January of 2019, just 3 months after their wedding. She found a collection notice that had been mistakenly delivered to their apartment. When she confronted David, he broke down, admitted everything, begged for forgiveness. Jessica was devastated, but wanted to work through it. She insisted they start couples counseling, that David get help for what she suspected was a gambling addiction. David agreed, but he never actually scheduled any counseling sessions.
Instead, he told Jessica he had started seeing a therapist, even invented details about the appointments. The lies were compounding, layer upon layer, and David was drowning under the weight of his own deception. But there was something else, something darker, that Jessica didn't know about. David had developed a disturbing fascination with true crime, specifically with cases involving family annihilators. He spent hours late at night watching documentaries, reading case files, diving deep into the psychology of men who killed their families. His browser history, later recovered by investigators, showed hundreds of searches related to these cases. He was particularly fixated on cases where the perpetrator claimed memory loss or temporary insanity. Jessica's best friend, Amanda Torres, would later testify that Jessica had mentioned David's true crime obsession. She said Jessica found it unsettling, especially because David seemed drawn to the most violent, disturbing cases. But Jessica rationalized it, told Amanda that lots of people watch true crime content, that it didn't mean anything sinister. In early February, just weeks before her death, Jessica confided in Amanda about something else. She suspected David might be having an affair. She had noticed him being secretive with his phone, stepping outside to take calls, being vague about where he'd been. When Jessica tried to access David's phone one night while he was sleeping, she discovered he'd changed his passcode. When she asked him about it the next morning, he became defensive, accused her of not trusting him, said she was being paranoid because of the debt issue. Jessica backed off, but the suspicion remained. She started paying closer attention to David's behavior, his patterns, his moods. What she noticed frightened her. David seemed to be having conversations with himself, muttering under his breath. His sleep became erratic. Some nights he'd be awake until 3 or 4 in the morning. Other nights he'd take sleeping pills and be
completely unconscious. Jessica told Amanda she was scared, that something felt very wrong, but she didn't know what to do. On February 18, 2019, Jessica texted Amanda, "I think David is having a breakdown. I'm worried about him. I'm worried about us." Amanda responded, encouraged Jessica to reach out to David's father to get help. Jessica said she would, but she wanted to wait until after the weekend. David's father was out of town at a ministry conference, and Jessica didn't want to bother him while he was traveling. She never got the chance. The night of February 19th started normally enough. David came home from his job at a local nonprofit around 6 in the evening. Jessica had made dinner, chicken and vegetables, one of David's favorites. According to David's later testimony, they ate together, watched some television, had what seemed like a pleasant, unremarkable evening. Around 10 o'clock, David said he took some over-the-counter sleep medication. He'd been using it frequently, he claimed, because of insomnia. He told investigators he took double the recommended dose because he was desperate for a good night's sleep. Within an hour, he said, he was unconscious. But what happened next is where David's story becomes confusing, disturbing, and ultimately unbelievable. At 3:47 a.m., a 911 call came in from the Henry residence. The operator answered to the sound of screaming, panicked, incoherent screaming. It took nearly 30 seconds for the operator to understand what the caller was saying. When David finally formed complete sentences, what he said sent chills through everyone who heard the recording. "I think I killed my wife. Oh God, I think I killed Jessica. There's blood everywhere. I don't know what happened. I was dreaming. I was having a nightmare. I woke up and oh God, she's not breathing. I think I stabbed her. Why is there a knife? Why is there so much blood?" The operator tried to keep David calm, tried to get him to check if Jessica was still alive, to perform CPR. But David seemed unable to process the instructions. He kept repeating the same phrases. "I was dreaming. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was in a dream." Police and paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. What they found in the bedroom of that small apartment was a scene of horrific violence. Jessica was lying on the bed, covered in stab wounds. Investigators would later count 23 separate puncture wounds across her chest, neck, and arms. The bedding was soaked with blood. A kitchen knife, an 8-inch chef's knife from the couple's own knife block, was on the floor beside the bed. David was sitting on the floor in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, still repeating that he'd been dreaming, that he didn't understand what happened. But there was something the first responders noticed immediately, something that didn't fit with David's story of just waking up and discovering the horror. David had showered. His hair was damp. He was wearing clean clothes, and when police examined the bathroom, they found Jessica's blood in the sink, in the shower, on a towel that had been hastily stuffed behind the toilet. David had cleaned himself before calling 911. He had changed his clothes, washed the blood off his hands and body, and then made the call. When detectives questioned him about this later, David claimed he didn't remember cleaning himself. He said it must have happened while he was still in a sleep state, that the sleep medication had caused some kind of dissociative episode. But investigators weren't buying it. They'd seen crime scenes before where perpetrators tried to establish an insanity defense, tried to claim they weren't in control of their actions. And David's story had too many inconsistencies, too many convenient gaps in memory. Detectives began digging into David's background, his online activity, his financial situation, his relationship with Jessica. What they found painted a picture of a young man spiraling out of control, drowning in debt and lies, trapped in a life he didn't want, married to a woman who was starting to see through his facade. They discovered his obsessive research into family annihilator cases. They found journal entries where David wrote about feeling trapped, about wanting to escape his life, but feeling like there was no way out. In one particularly chilling entry from just a week before Jessica's murder, David wrote, "I watched a documentary about a man who killed his family in their sleep. They said he claimed he didn't remember doing it, that it was like watching himself from outside his body. I wonder what that feels like. I wonder if it's peaceful, not being responsible for your own actions." When detectives showed David this journal entry during interrogation, his demeanor shifted. The confused, traumatized husband act began to crack. He became angry, defensive, accused the police of twisting his words, of not understanding what he meant. But the more they pressed, the more David's story fell apart. Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed even more damning evidence. The blood spatter patterns indicated that Jessica had been awake during the attack, that she had tried to defend herself. Her hands had defensive wounds, cuts across her palms where she had tried to grab the knife. The attack hadn't happened while she slept peacefully. Jessica had fought for her life. And the timeline didn't match David's claims. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated Jessica had been dead for at least 2 to 3 hours before David called 911. That means David hadn't immediately discovered her body and called for help. He'd waited, cleaned himself, changed his clothes, possibly even staged parts of the scene.
Prosecutors consulted with sleep specialists and pharmacologists about David's claim that over-the-counter sleep medication could cause violent sleepwalking. Every expert gave the same answer. While sleepwalking can occur with certain medications, the level of sustained, purposeful violence exhibited in Jessica's murder was not consistent with any known sleepwalking episode. And the fact that David had cleaned himself afterward, had changed clothes, had waited hours before calling 911, all of that required conscious decision-making that simply doesn't happen during sleep states. David was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. David had murdered Jessica in a calculated act, motivated by a desire to escape his failing marriage, his financial problems, and the life he felt trapped in. They argued that David had researched other family annihilator cases, not out of morbid curiosity, but as a blueprint, that he'd planned to claim sleepwalking or temporary insanity as his defense. The trial began in November of 2019, almost 9 months after Jessica's death.
It attracted significant media attention, partly because of David's connection to the church, partly because of the shocking nature of the crime. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically. The journal entries, the online searches, the financial motive, the forensic evidence showing Jessica had been awake and fighting for her life, the timeline proving David had waited hours before calling for help. David's defense team argued that he was suffering from a psychological break, that the combination of stress, debt, sleep deprivation, and medication had created a perfect storm that led to a dissociative episode. They brought in their own experts who testified about rare cases of medication-induced violence. But under cross-examination, even these experts admitted they'd never seen a case quite like David's, where the person claimed to have no memory of the act, but had clear memory of actions taken afterward. The most devastating testimony came from Jessica's family and friends. Amanda Torres took the stand and described Jessica's fears in the weeks leading up to her death, her suspicions about David's behavior, her worry that something was very wrong. Jessica's mother, Patricia Henry, who'd welcomed David into their family with open arms, sobbed as she described losing her daughter to the man she'd trusted to protect her. And then Pastor Robert Henry testified, David's own father. He spoke about the warning signs he'd missed, the concerns he'd dismissed. He admitted that David had been stealing from the church, that he'd confronted him about it, but hadn't involved the police because he wanted to give his son a chance to make things right. Pastor Robert's testimony was heartbreaking. A father forced to acknowledge that his son was a killer. A pastor who'd preached about redemption and forgiveness, now facing the ultimate test of those beliefs. In his closing argument, the prosecutor addressed the jury directly. David Henry wants you to believe that he's a victim of circumstances beyond his control, but the evidence tells a different story. This was not a tragic accident. This was not a medical episode. This was murder, plain and simple, premeditated, calculated, and carried out with full conscious intent. Jessica Henry was 28 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She was taken from this world by someone who promised to love and protect her, someone she trusted completely. Don't let David Henry hide behind a convenient excuse. Hold him accountable for what he did. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. They found David Henry guilty of first-degree murder. At sentencing, the judge showed no mercy. He sentenced David to life in prison without the possibility of parole, calling the crime one of the most disturbing cases of domestic violence he'd seen in his 30 years on the bench. Jessica's family released a statement after the verdict. They expressed relief that justice had been served, but acknowledged that no verdict could bring Jessica back, could fill the void her absence left in their lives. Patricia Henry said, "My daughter was a light in this world. She loved deeply, trusted completely, and saw the best in people. That goodness, that trust, was weaponized against her by someone who should have treasured it. I hope that wherever Jessica is now, she knows she was loved, she is missed, and she will never be forgotten." This case raises difficult questions about trust, about the masks people wear, about the warning signs we miss or choose to ignore. David Henry presented himself as a devout Christian, a future pastor, a loving husband. But beneath that carefully constructed image was a man drowning in deception, willing to destroy everything and everyone around him rather than face the truth of who he'd become. Some have tried to use this case to make broader statements about religion, about the church, about Christianity itself. But that misses the point entirely. David Henry was not a faithful Christian. He was a fraud who used religion as a cover, who hid behind faith to mask his true nature. Real faith, real spirituality is about truth, about accountability, about facing yourself honestly and striving to be better. David rejected all of that. He chose lies, chose violence, chose to take an innocent life rather than face the consequences of his own actions. Jessica deserved so much better. She deserved a partner who honored her trust, who met her love with honesty, who valued her life above his own comfort. Instead, she got betrayal in its most absolute form. If you or someone you know is in a relationship where you feel unsafe, where warning signs are appearing, please reach out for help. Contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline, talk to friends and family, make a safety plan. Jessica's story reminds us that violence can come from the most unexpected places, from people we think we know completely. Rest in peace, Jessica J. Henry.